Most people assume that if something is blocking their financial progress, they would know it. They imagine a visible problem, a lack of skill, a lack of opportunity, a lack of motivation, something obvious, something concrete, something they can point to and say, "That's the reason." But what if the real thing affecting your financial life isn't obvious at all? What if the biggest force shaping your results is something happening so quietly, so consistently, that you've stopped noticing it entirely? Because for many people, that's exactly what's happening. They're not lazy. They're not incapable. They're not unaware of what they want. And yet, they feel stuck in the same patterns year after year, trying, adjusting, working harder, learning more. But somehow, the outcome barely changes. Or worse, they make progress for a while, only to lose momentum again. And after enough repetitions, they start believing something dangerous. They start believing that struggle is just how life works for them, that maybe they're simply not the type of person who gets ahead financially. But that belief usually appears after years of experiencing something they never fully understood, an invisible pattern, a force operating underneath behavior. And the reason it's so difficult to detect is because it doesn't always feel dramatic. Most of the time, it feels normal. It feels like everyday thinking, everyday emotions, everyday decisions. That's what makes it powerful, because the things that shape your life the most are often the things you stop questioning. For example, have you ever noticed how two people can have access to similar opportunities, but respond to them completely differently? One person moves quickly, takes action, adapts, stays consistent. The other hesitates, overthinks, doubts themselves, starts and stops repeatedly. And over time, their financial lives move in completely different directions. From the outside, it looks like one person simply had better luck, better timing, better circumstances. But many times, the real difference started internally long before any result appeared externally, because your financial reality is deeply connected to the patterns running beneath your awareness, patterns of expectation, patterns of emotional reaction, patterns of self-perception. And most people never examine them. They only look at outcomes. They see the bank account, the bills, the stress, the inconsistency. But they don't look at the internal structure producing those outcomes repeatedly. That's why so many people stay trapped in cycles they can't explain. A person says they want financial freedom, but internally, they associate money with pressure, guilt, fear, or instability. Another person wants success, but deep down they don't fully believe they can sustain it. Another wants abundance, but subconsciously expects disappointment every time something starts going well. And these internal expectations quietly shape behavior, not in dramatic ways, in subtle ways. Small hesitations, small delays, small emotional reactions. But repeated consistently over time, those small reactions become a pattern, and patterns become identity. That's when people start saying things like, "I've always struggled financially. Money never stays with me. Things never work out for me," not realizing they are reinforcing the very structure keeping them stuck. Because the brain constantly looks for evidence to confirm what feels familiar, even if what feels familiar is painful. This is one of the reasons change feels so difficult for many people. It's not just about learning new actions. It's about confronting invisible emotional conditioning that has been repeated for years. And most of that conditioning didn't start in adulthood. It started much earlier, through observation, environment, repeated experiences, emotional associations formed over time. Maybe growing up, money was always connected to stress, arguments, scarcity, fear, uncertainty. Maybe success seemed distant. Maybe wealthy people were viewed negatively. Maybe stability always felt temporary. When experiences repeat emotionally enough times, The brain stops treating them like temporary events. It starts treating them like truth. And once something feels true internally, your behavior unconsciously organizes around it. That's why people can sabotage progress without realizing it. Not because they consciously want failure, but because unfamiliar success can feel emotionally unsafe. Think about that for a moment. If struggle has been emotionally familiar for years, then stability can actually feel uncomfortable at first. Not logically, emotionally. And most people never notice this contradiction happening inside them. They simply experience the symptoms. They procrastinate. They lose focus. They avoid opportunities. They abandon consistency. Then they blame themselves afterward. But underneath those behaviors is often something deeper, an invisible internal resistance to change. This is also why motivation alone rarely creates lasting transformation. Motivation is temporary, but internal conditioning is persistent. You can feel inspired for a few days, a few weeks, even a few months. But if your deeper patterns remain unchanged, eventually your behavior returns to what feels emotionally familiar. That's why people repeat cycles. They don't just repeat actions. They repeat emotional states. And those emotional states shape perception. For example, someone operating from fear tends to notice risk first. Someone operating from scarcity tends to focus on limitation first. Someone operating from self-doubt tends to hesitate before action. Over time, these repeated responses influence decisions, and decisions shape outcomes. That's why the invisible force affecting your finances isn't only external economics, bad luck, or opportunity gaps. For many people, the invisible force is the emotional pattern silently influencing every financial decision they make. The way they think about money, the way they react to pressure, the way they interpret setbacks, the way they define possibility. Most people never realize how much their internal state affects their external reality. Because the effect is gradual, subtle, accumulated over years. But once you start seeing the pattern, you begin understanding why effort alone often isn't enough. Two people can work equally hard, but produce completely different results because they're operating from completely different internal frameworks. One person moves with clarity, the other moves with internal conflict. One expects growth, the other expects disappointment. One sees opportunities, the other sees potential failure, and eventually, their external lives reflect those internal expectations, not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently over time. Now, this doesn't mean you simply think positively and money magically appears. That's where many manifestation conversations become misleading. Real change is deeper than surface-level positivity. It's about identifying the emotional patterns quietly controlling your behavior and gradually changing your relationship with them. Because awareness changes things. The moment you begin noticing these invisible reactions, they stop controlling you automatically. You start recognizing, why do I always pull back right before progress? Why do I feel uncomfortable when things begin improving? Why do I lose consistency after momentum builds? Those questions matter because they shift your attention from blaming circumstances to understanding patterns. And once patterns become visible, they become interruptible. That's when real transformation begins. Not overnight, not through magical thinking, but through repeated awareness and different emotional conditioning over time. This is why some people eventually break cycles that controlled them for decades. Not because they suddenly became different people overnight, but because they stopped operating unconsciously. They stopped reinforcing the same internal reactions every day. They started creating emotional stability instead of emotional survival. And slowly, their decisions changed. Their consistency changed. Their confidence changed. Their financial behavior changed. Then eventually, their results changed too. Because external results tend to follow internal patterns much more than most people realize. And if you've been feeling blocked financially, despite your effort, despite your intentions, despite wanting more for your life, there's a chance the real issue isn't visible on the surface at all. There's a chance you've been fighting an invisible pattern without recognizing it. Not because you're weak, not because you're incapable, but because most people were never taught how deeply internal conditioning affects external outcomes. They were only taught to work harder, push harder, force harder, ignore what's happening internally. But eventually, unresolved internal patterns always appear externally, in relationships, in habits, in finances, in consistency, everywhere. The good news is that once you begin seeing these patterns clearly, you stop feeling powerless against them. You realize your reactions are not fixed identities, they're conditioned responses. And conditioned responses can change. That realization alone changes everything. Because instead of saying, "This is just who I am," you begin asking, "What pattern have I been repeating without noticing?" And that question opens the door to a completely different future. A future where you stop unconsciously recreating the same financial struggles over and over again. A future where your actions begin aligning instead of conflicting internally. A future where progress no longer feels temporary, because the invisible force that once controlled your financial life unconsciously has finally become visible. And once something becomes visible, it can change. If this video made you see your financial patterns differently, subscribe to the channel. Because in the next videos, we're going deeper into the hidden psychological and emotional mechanisms that silently shape wealth, consistency, and personal transformation. And if you want to understand the deeper process behind these invisible financial blocks, there's something important waiting for you in the description and pinned comment. It explains how these subconscious patterns are formed, why they keep repeating, and what begins to change when you finally stop reinforcing them unconsciously. If you're tired of feeling stuck in cycles you can't explain, that's your next step. And I'll see you in the next video.